Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we're featuring a keynote from our virtual Winter Institute 2021 titled Novelist as Citizen.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Winter Institute. I'm Michelle Malonzo, buyer at Changing Hands Bookstore in Arizona, and I'll be moderating our event titled The Novelist as Citizen to discuss the state of literature and what the future holds for the novelist in the midst of political upheaval. Joining me is Lauren Groff, two-time National Book Award finalist and the New York Times bestselling author of 3 novels, The Monsters of Templeton, Arcadia, and Fates and Furies, as well as the short story collections Florida, winner of the 2019 Story Prize, and Delicate Edible Birds. She has won the Penn O. Henry Award and has been a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her work has been featured in The New Yorker, along with several Best American Short Stories anthologies, and she was named one of Granta's 2017 Best Young American Novelists. She lives in Gainesville, Florida, with her husband and sons. Also with us tonight is Viet Thanh Nguyen, who was born in Vietnam and raised in America. He is the author of The Sympathizer, which was awarded the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, alongside 6 other prizes. He is also the author of the short story collection The Refugees, the nonfiction book Nothing Ever Dies, a finalist for the National Book Award, and is the editor of an anthology of refugee writing, The Displaced. He is the Errol Arnold Professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California and a recipient of the fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations. This year, he became the first Asian American member of the Pulitzer Board. He lives in Los Angeles. Last but not least, Colson Whitehead, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 10 works of fiction and nonfiction, and is a 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for The Nickel Boys and The Underground Railroad, which also won the National Book Award. He is a recipient of MacArthur and Guggenheim fellowships and lives in New York City. And those were the short bios, because that's the level of talent we have with us. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us this virtual Winter Institute. So before we sort of get into the big question of the novelist as citizen, which we can only really skim the surface, if any. I know everyone wants to know about your new books, and I want to talk about them a little bit because in having to read all of them in succession, there's some just interesting threads and commonalities that they share. So I'll start off with you, Lauren. The Matrix, coming from Riverhead in September. A book about mysticism and nuns in 12th century France, which as a recovering Catholic, my heart burst. You said on Twitter, it was inspired after a talk on medieval nuns, and that, quote, your brain exploded into rainbows. Mine did as well when I read it. So why this story? Why did you feel the need to write it now? Where did it come from?
So this story is actually written in 2 veins. One is the book itself, Matrix itself, which I truly, after 2016, I just wanted to live with only women and no men at all, right? This is a world of just women, powerful, interesting, wild women. But also it stands alone, but it's also part of it's not a trilogy. It's like a confab of 3 books about women and and climate change and religion and the way that religion has hurt us all in terms of climate change. So it's this one, and then 400 years later, there's a book coming out probably 2022 called The Vaster Wilds, and then I'm working on one for now too. So it's this larger epic vision of how we got to where we are. Yeah.
That is very exciting. And then we have Harlem Shuffle. You have written, Colson, a historical fiction, a novel about zombies, played with magical realism, and now a crime novel. I mean, I felt like I was watching Goodfellas or watching Fargo, the TV series, when I was reading this. about a slightly crooked furniture dealer in Harlem in the early 60s, the backdrop being the civil rights movement. Reading it, I felt like that backdrop was really just this summer, the similarities, the sameness of it. So why this story and why a crime novel?
Yeah, well, I mean, my first book, The Intuitionist, takes off from detective fiction, but comes at it from a sort of, slanted way. Some Pomo trickery, and this is doing it sort of straight on. And so it's fun to approach, the genre with sincerity and figure out what I like from the tradition, what I don't like. And I guess I had the idea in 2014, which was the last year I had ideas. Like I started the Underground Railroad that year. I came across a story that became the Nickel Boys, and I had this idea for a heist novel. And basically, I was thinking about I love heist movies, whether it's lo-fi like Rafifi or hi-fi like Ocean's 11. And there's always that part where they pull off the heist, they've done all this work, and then they bring the gems to a fence, and he's like, I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar. I'm like, no, like you deserve everything. I was like, I hate the fence. And so I figured I should write a book about a fence. So he's a small-time dealer in stolen goods and gets caught up in a heist from his ne'er-do-well cousin and enters the lifestyle with a little more gusto. And, I usually write a book that's more serious and one that has, maybe more jokes. And Nickel Boys and Underground are both two really heavy novels. So I was really excited to, be able to crack a few jokes and be weirder than the last two books allowed me to do.
That's amazing. It was the perfect crime novel for me. And I don't even read crime, but I love it. Viet, the committed. Wow. But also, why was this story not done? The sequel to The Sympathizer. I never would have thought, personally, there would have been a sequel. So why was this story of the spook and the spy and the sleeper not done? What brought you back?
Well, I didn't set out to write a trilogy with The Sympathizer. It was supposed to be a one-off novel, spy novel, refugee novel, war novel. But when I reached the end, I thought, I'm not done with this character, and he's not done with me. And partly the ambition was that there was more story to be told, but there's more fun to be had too. So with The Sympathizer, I set out to try to offend everybody, and judging my hate mail, I succeeded. And then with The Committed, he's half French. He's part French and part Vietnamese. And The Sympathizer partly touched on his French heritage, but I really wanted to go all out and offend the French with The Committed. So it's set in Paris in the early 1980s. And, the narrator has been demolished by his experiences in war and re-education. And so he's a wreck by the time he gets to Paris. And he does terrible things like he should not do. So these are about his misadventures, becoming a drug dealer and interacting with the left liberal intellectual set in Paris. So it's a satire. It's supposed to be funny, but it's also supposed to be pretty serious because it continues the critique of colonialism and racism and misogyny, because part of the politics of The Sympathizer was that it was an exploration of masculinity and heterosexuality. And I thought, well, he sort of needs to go deeper into this. So The Committed deals with all these facets of politics and his own personality.
So that's a perfect segue into, because each of your books is really, I don't want to say attacking, but it's really dissecting the various aspects of racism, classism, misogyny in the world. And, all of it came to a head in 2020. Everything that was sort of simmering that we saw and we knew just burst. So with that being said of 2020, the lessons we're trying to learn, what does it mean for you to be a writer now? To be an artist, how has that changed your craft in any way?
I'll try and answer that. I mean, The Committed was actually done before all the COVID events and the murder of George Floyd and and all of this. And of course, those events have had a huge impact on me, and mostly on my social media posting, where in the last few months of 2020, I was waging social media wars with all kinds of people around these kinds of issues, including my own fellow Vietnamese Americans, a lot of whom are not, sympathetic to these kinds of issues. So, but for me, it felt like these events, as horrible as they were just extreme manifestations of things that I've seen my entire life in the United States. And certainly if you're a student of American history, you can see it going all the way back to the origins of the country. So I feel like my writing has always been trying to engage with these kinds of issues. And of course that they take on more urgency under such horrifying and spectacular moments. But in reality, if you think of yourself as a writer concerned with these kinds of issues, or a political writer in some way, you're aware that you've always had to grapple with them in one way or another.
Yeah, so I guess taking off from that, and writing books before a time of upheaval. The last two books were about institutional racism, and when Nickel Boys came out in foreign territories last year, people would ask me, to talk about how prescient the book is. How do you know you're entering this phase? And frankly, if you just talk about fucked up racial shit, eventually we're going to have another incident that makes it relevant again, because you're not you're not looking to the future, you're diagnosing the present. And so some of my books have a political component, sometimes they don't. But if you're talking about race and capitalism, we're talking about problems that are never solved. They're ongoing dilemmas that we grapple with. And any book that sort of tries to tackle them ends up being, relevant and to what's happening now.
I've been asking myself over the past few years what it means to be an artist, and honestly, every time you ask yourself a question like that, it just sort of fragments into a million other questions. But I don't know. I do think that art is inherently oppositional, especially when it comes to moral issues. And I think that if you are paying attention to the world, your work is going to be political, or be engaged in political directions, I think. So I think, the exacerbation of all of the elements that have happened throughout American history in the last year and that are ongoing now, I don't know how one reacts to them other than to just take the piece of the world that we know and to bear down with as much attention as possible and to do the work that calls to you most dearly. And something will come of it that will speak about injustice and immorality in the world at large.
So all of these novels are historically based in one way or another. 12th century France, you're in the early 60s, you're in Paris in the early 80s, and there's a lot of philosophy and everything that's going on during that time. You talk about Viet Thanh Nguyen a lot. And because these novels are so relevant to our present moment, what is it, I don't want to say what is the value of exploring the past, but how do you write historically based fiction as something more than allegory? Because everyone's looking for what you're trying to say or the message you're trying to receive. So how do you write historically based fiction that is more than just allegory?
Well, for me, it's become useful because my first couple of novels dealt with contemporary America. And I think I've ran out of things to say about contemporary America. I think there's like a really angry 25-year-old who probably has his or her pulse on what's wrong. I'm a middle-aged dude. I don't have that same kind of fire anymore. And I found that historical stories allow me to say something new. Talking about slavery, Jim Crow, New York in the 1960s. I find I'm not repeating myself, and I'm finding different ways to talk about New York. New York is a recurring motif in my work. How can I explore it again from a different angle? I've talked about race in, say, John Henry days. How can I take a historical novel and examine it a different way. So for me, it's a way of keeping the work fresh, and I'm finding a lot of material there.
Well, I think in terms of writing a historical novel, I do two things. One is you pay attention to the specificity of the history, and that makes it fun. You do learn new things, and you're immersed in different textures that can be very fun to look at. And then, of course, human beings haven't changed that much in centuries or obviously just in decades. So there is something universal about certain kinds of feelings or things that we do, unfortunately or fortunately. So the end of The Sympathizer, for example, is about torture in the 1970s. And as I was writing some of that stuff, I mean, Abu Ghraib had just happened, right? So, and the torture techniques that were being used in the late 1970s were being used in Abu Ghraib. And so it didn't take much of a stretch to just, not even point it out, but if you just talked about these things and your reader's cognizant of history, they'll make the connections. And likewise, you brought up Frantz Fanon. He wrote The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks in the 50s and early 60s. I still teach his work because it's still absolutely relevant. And I could quote him in The Committed in the 1980s because things haven't changed that much from the 60s to the 80s to the present. And that just goes back to the first question that you raised, which is that the various problems I think that all of us are engaged in are deep and enduring. And the hopes that at least I think I'm engaged in are also deep and enduring as well.
I always have anxiety about going into history because of exactly what you were asking, Michelle. I mean, how do you know that it's going to be more than just allegorical? And I honestly make myself incredibly stupid at the beginning of any project, and I try not to have any meaning at all. I just try to write into the thing that's sort of lighting me up on the inside and trying to understand what it is about that is so fascinating. And so you follow your love into the work, and eventually for me, it just becomes something else and becomes something that responds to the present moment in general. And if it doesn't, I have to find a way to do that with lots of crying and a lot of naps and 12-mile runs where I'm weeping to myself. So eventually, through the work, it becomes more apparent what it is that I wanted to say. I write out of deep inarticulateness into hopefully an articulation of something that I care about very deeply.
Yeah, I'm in a weeping and napping phase right now. It's something new, so totally relate.
It's every day. That's all I do.
I think really we're all in a weeping phase still. I don't think that's going away. Okay, so now I want to just build a little bit on that while changing gears. So, which will touch upon your op-ed that you wrote, Viet, about the future of literature. Francine Prose wrote in the New York Times article a while back that, quote, fiction can enable us to see the world through the eyes of people unlike ourselves and view them more empathetically. Such changes may make us more likely to favor the creation of a more humane society. If publishers, booksellers, and readers praise books as this great purveyor of empathy, but as you were quoted, as you said in the article, Viet, empathy is perfectly compatible with killing people overseas, many of them innocent, and backing up a police and carceral system that disproportionately harms Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the poor. Then what is the role of books in this push for the creation of a more humane society? Empathy is not enough.
Sorry about that. I'm a deep believer in empathy and the power of literature and books and the necessity for all those kinds of things. I don't disagree with Francine Prose. I don't disagree with Martha Nussbaum, who makes a very similar argument about the necessity for great books in humanizing us. And of course, people who don't read books and who don't read literature, and this was partly the point of the essay, are dangerous people because they may lack a certain desire to see the world from the point of view of others. Now, that being said, I think we have to be worried about sentimental celebrations of the power of literature as well, because I think my argument is right, that you can have people who are sensitive and cultured and still be in control of the machinery of the state that results in the death of innocent people, whether it's within our carceral system and systemic racial injustice within the United States, or at the hands of our military-industrial complex overseas. And I think especially in the latter case, Americans of many political persuasions, including the progressive ones, have a very hard time imagining that other people might not be happy being hit by drone strikes, even if Americans think that this is a civilized way of conducting warfare. It is still warfare. And so I think the role of literature in this sense is not only to cultivate empathy for others and to depict them in a humanistic fashion, it's also sometimes to poke people in the eye, to make them uncomfortable. And some people do not want that from their literature. It's a lot easier to cry and to feel sympathetic and to feel good walking away from a book thinking you understand someone better versus feeling unsettled and worried about your own complicity and the deep problems of your own society that you may not be able to address. And I think I myself, as a writer and a reader, am totally implicated in that. So it's a very difficult thing to do and to engage with as a writer and as a reader to want to provoke as well as to empathize.
I guess, personally, I'm not really sure what literature is for. I mean, I think it helps me make sense of the world for myself. And sometimes with a project, I'm trying to figure out how I work, sometimes how the world works. And then sometimes people come along for the ride, readers, and then sometimes they don't. It's much nicer when they do. So I can't pull back and say, what impact will the Underground Railroad have, Nickel Boys have. I'm delighted when I talk to high school kids and they've never really thought about Jim Crow in that way before, how Jim Crow worked. And that's very lovely. It's not, I didn't go in with the intention to teach people, but our educational system is so crappy that sometimes a novel will stand in for historical text. So basically, I just try to do, I won't say it's art for art's sake, but write a project that's right for me at that time. And say 3 years ago was the Nickel Boys, as I was trying to reconcile my hopes for the country and my deep pessimism. And those ideas became manifested in the two main characters. And then sometimes there's no sort of political component at all. And I'm writing about going to the World Series of Poker, or writing about New York City. And so I try to not write a bad book first, and then I'm incredibly delighted when other people come along after.
Yeah, I do feel like there is a fundamental question here. Oh, I'm sorry, Colson, were you finished? Or
No.
Right. Which is, what is the purpose of literature, right? And it varies depending on the reader. I think there are readers in the world who do not look for their literature to educate or inform or to be utilitarian in any way, who just respond to the books out of an aesthetic pleasure. And is that any less of a purpose than someone who reads for political engagement or opposition or discomfort or empathy? I don't know. I don't read for pure pleasure. I read for a very a relational mixture that depends on who I am at the moment and the world at large as well, right? We're all sort of wild creatures just sort of trying to survive. I think that's one of the questions in Viet's wonderful article that sort of was raised, was what is the purpose of literature? Does the purpose matter to the reader? Does the purpose matter to the writer at the time? And I have no answers, but like 500 more questions. Thank you so much for that.
So then to go into the writing practice, we talk about, everyone now is talking about equity and inclusion. And we talk about it's at the forefront for publishing and bookselling. But for you as writers, as artists, what does that mean for the art product? How do you create an equitable product?
Yeah, I don't think about it in that way. I think about being truthful to how we, as truthful as I can be about how people work and how the world works. And I'm not necessarily thinking about equity, but I'm drawn to stories that deal with political imbalances, with institutional racism, with different kinds of power dynamics. And so you end up, if you have any sort of empathy or sympathy for your characters and the world they live in, that translates into an equitable product, I guess.
I think sometimes, sometimes from inside a writing project, you don't see the work as a product, right? So I think there's a difference between the act of writing and the act of putting it into the world, in which case it becomes a product. But when you're writing, you're really just like focusing in with as much attention as possible on the truth of what's happening at the moment. And then at a certain point, other people read it and it becomes a product that bookstores hopefully sell, right? And so it becomes an interaction with other people. And so for me, like the difficulty in this question is understanding when that shift happens. And if you're like, I try very hard in the beginning not to even pay attention to other potential readers, right? So it's not a product whatsoever. It's like me just like wrestling with all the demons in the world on the page. So it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer, but I bet Viet does.
I do. Okay, let me give it a shot. Think about the equivalent in terms of Hollywood casting, for example. You watch TV shows, you watch movies, and if you look at it and you think, oh my God, everybody's white or everybody's male in an environment where they should not be all white or should not be all male, then you know it's a failure of the imagination of the casting and everyone involved in it. And that applies to some extent to literature because, when we think about casting a novel, let's say, who are you putting in your book? That question should at least be in people's minds. I don't want to legislate what people should put in their books, but if you have never paid any attention to the actual differences and diversities of the people in your environment, unless your environment really is all male and all white, then maybe that's something you should pay attention to as you think about who your characters are, the major and the minor ones. Now, that being said, I don't think equity in that sense has any relationship to making people feel good or having characters be nice or anything like that. You could have, a diverse set of people and they could all be total jerks. And that would be really interesting too. And so, for example, in The Sympathizer, I deliberately did think about making the character mixed race, part Vietnamese, part French, for very deliberate reasons of equity, if we're going to use that terminology. And of course, it gives us a view of the Vietnam War from a Vietnamese point of view, another gesture at equity. But he is a person who does terrible things and witnesses terrible things. And that makes some readers uncomfortable because I don't step in as a writer and say, that's bad, we should not do that, shame. No, so literature can both cast a fully rich and embodied world and demonstrate that all of us are capable of the full range of human possibilities, from the best in us to the worst in us.
Yeah, and picking up from Viet's point, Viet's word cast, I use that word a lot in my books. Who's going in and who's not going in. So Underground Railroad has a really big cast, and there are white villains, white heroes, black villains, black heroes, and particularly in schools, I would be asked, why are the other slaves on the Randall plantation terrible to Cora, the main character? That's because they're products of a traumatized existence. They're not going to be on their best behavior. They've been psychologically distorted. And so in movies, we have this idea of a plantation where everyone's helping each other. And I thought, well, in real life, a lot of these people have been horribly abused and tortured. They're not going to be this sort of happy family. And so having that realistic cast of heroes and villains of different races was important. With the Nickel Boys, I knew I wanted to be just about these two kids, two 16-year-olds. And I was not going to go into the backstory of the evil white guard, the evil white superintendent, in the same way I did in Underground Railroad, because it really was about the two boys and not having this really huge, well-rounded cast. The spotlight was on them. So for me, a lot of times it's an artistic choice. What best serves the story I'm trying to tell? And sometimes that means having a very varied cast, and then sometimes it's, two people on stage.
Now that I'm thinking about it, yes, you're both entirely right. With Matrix, I wanted from the beginning to make men be seen from the corner of the eye. So not even Jesus is seen fully in this convent. So, and that was intentional, right? Because I was trying to sort of flip the narrative of the Catholic Church from the time, which was so heavily male dominated, that women were seen peripherally. So it's an inversion of the way of history. So yeah, no, you're right. It comes out of the work itself, though, I think. And maybe later in editing, you start to play around with casting your books, or at least I do. Yeah.
So speaking of editing, because all of these books were written way before the horrible year of 2020, but you've had to edit them and revisit them and all of that. How has the backdrop of just the world that we are in now and everything, I mean, the amount of news alerts I get on my phone of some other terrible thing, how has that disrupted? How has your writing practice in general been disrupted? Because there's quarantine that has both isolated us and has made our lives way more transparent than ever before. How has it disrupted your writing practice?
For me, it's pretty much the same, except my family's in lockdown with me, and so going back to naps, everyone knows I nap a lot now. It's sort of embarrassing because no one's at school. It was like, Daddy, why are you lying in the dark again? It's like, it's my process. I lie in the dark. So it changed in that way. I was fortunate in that I only had like 60 pages to go on the Harlem Shuffle, and it was sort of downhill. Everyone's been introduced and the plot's moving. And so once being an IT person for my kids' Zoom classes sort of slowed down. If I get an hour here, hour there, it added up because I was close to the end. It felt, I think books have been hard because I've been broke, I've been depressed, I had newborns. There's always something terrible that's happening. And I was fortunate that, knowing my close family came down with COVID, or we mostly were indoors, and turned out so far we're okay. And so I think most of us have to adapt to changing life situations. We're teaching too much. There's no money. We have young kids, and so in terms of this book, it became another horrible thing in the world that tries to make you not work, and you have to sort of power through.
Well, all of that is true for me as well, except for the napping part. I don't do that, so I should. But part of also every book is a new challenge because of the changes in your life that Colson already talked about. But obviously, what also happened was isolation during COVID, and honestly, I have to say it didn't make any difference. I thought it was kind of great, except for everything happening outside the house, because I could stay at home, I could write. Turns out my son, 7 years old, also is, happy doing online schooling. So he's definitely my kid. So everything was cool, but what really went to hell was obviously, like you were saying, when George Floyd was murdered and the Black Lives Matter movement really took to the streets. And then, the Trump presidential issues started to heat up in the last half of the year. Very distracting for me, very distracting. And I also think of writing on social media as a form of writing, experimental writing, I guess. But a lot of articles have come out of the things I've written on social media. And that's both good and bad, because I just became so engaged in social media as a form of distraction from the other writing, but also engagement with the political issues of the time. And it became kind of toxic. I had like a Facebook page of 93,000 followers and lots of stuff. I was writing lots of stuff about the politics and all that kind of thing. And on December 26th, I blew that page up. I just like, Trump is no longer going to be president. I don't have to do this anymore, and got rid of it. And I've been much more disengaged from that part of the writing world on social media. And I feel so much better right now. And then the last thing I have to say, I'm a teacher, I'm a professor. Really, that's the worst. I love my students, but that's the worst because I don't get any writing done when I'm teaching. Things slow down a great deal. So I didn't get any writing done in the last few months of the fall semester. And then in the month of winter break, I wrote like 30,000 words. So that's the way it goes.
I feel like last year was like a cataclysm of all the things that I've been writing about and afraid of for years and years, like the pandemic. I've been writing about pandemic, like exacerbation of climate change and, children vulnerable. And it's just like horrific. And I'm unfortunately a person who's very, very anxious, and I get taken down these dark spirals. And when the pandemic hit, we were in Florida, but I don't trust Floridians to do the right thing almost ever. And so we took off in the car to New Hampshire, where I was single parenting for 6 months in the woods with like really spotty Wi-Fi with 2 children whom I love. Which I feel like I have to say, it was the hardest thing I have done in my life, right? Like, holy moly. I like the only time I had alone was running in the woods when I let them be on their iPads for like an hour. And like, I would like meet bears and be like, just eat me. Like, I don't, this is horrible. So I was just editing at the time. It was really unbelievably hard. And I have so much sympathy for, the women who've just dropped out of the workforce in particular. I mean, a lot of people have dropped out of the workforce, but it's going to take a generation for us to get back into the workforce after the pandemic. I mean, the caregivers who've had to just let their lives go in order to make it through this pandemic are struggling right now. Yeah.
Which was one of the reasons I wanted to ask, because I know you all have families, and that has been the biggest issue is your kids can't go to school. They're with you. They're with you all the time.
My 9-year-old would sit in my lap all day if I let him, and I don't let him. But I get up now at 4 just to work, just to have that time to work, because otherwise it's like someone needing something.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to be wrapping up soon. So I want to ask this question. I am a huge fan of Tembe Denton-Hurst, who has a column in New York Magazine's The Strategist called In Context. And she asked authors what books they were reading while writing their own. So I want to borrow from that premise to close this out, because why not end out with you wonderful authors talking about the books they love. So what books were you reading, whether it was for pleasure or research, while writing these new novels that will be out in the world soon this year? And what books do you feel your book is in conversation with?
Well, the Keynote is set in Paris in the early 1980s, and besides being a thriller, it's also kind of philosophical. It engages with various kinds of thinkers at that time, or who were talking about racism and colonialism. So it was a real pleasure to go back and reread Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks, Wretched of the Earth, reread Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. I reread a lot of French classics as well, because I wanted to, cite them or engage with them or fight them, including Candide's Voltaire, which I read when I was a little boy. I loved it. Going back to it as an adult, a little bit of a different experience. So all that was really a lot of fun. And then, what was surprising was, I had not read this book called The Powers of Horror by Julia Kristeva, who's a major French feminist philosopher, linguistic philosopher. When I was in grad school, I should have read it, but I didn't. I read it for this book. And it turns out I should have read it 20 years ago, because she predicted exactly what I was going to do in The Committed. So it was really a lot of fun to read that book, to see myself, working in the same line of thinking with this French feminist philosopher, and to cite her in The Committed.
Well, my work has stayed the same in the last like two or 3 years of heavy news, but my reading has definitely changed. And definitely the last year since the lockdown, I can't read for fun. I can only read for work, which is good because I have to work to eat. But definitely my leisure reading, I get distracted very easily because of the news or, what is Trump doing now, whatever. So hopefully I'll be pulling out of that. And so mostly just reading crime novels and then histories of New York. So I finally finished. Well, actually, I didn't finish. I got 3/4 of the way through Robert Caro's was The Power Broker. I read 20 pages in like 2001, and I took like a 16-year break. And I read another 800 pages last year. And then I'll get to the last 200 pages maybe this year. And then crime novels, I started reading detective novels to research Harlem Shuffle, and I realized I didn't actually care about detectives, only wanted to read about sociopaths. And so my Mod Squad inspiration for Harlem Shuffle was Richard Stark, Donald Westlake's pseudonym, Patricia Highsmith, and Chester Himes. They all sort of writing in the 50s and 60s, time period of my book. They enter the mind of the criminal, and it's more interesting to be in a criminal's mind than a detective, for me anyway, this year. So just crime novels and histories of New York, and trying, I know 70s New York, I don't know 60s New York, and so research was walking around trying to figure out where my people live, and then I would, tell my mother about all my research because she lived in Harlem in the 60s, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I went to that chock full of nuts all the time. I hung out in the Hotel Teresa." So she's just been asking her because she knows more about it than I can find.
So the only socially acceptable way of abandoning your family is reading. So I tend to read about 300 books a year just to get away from everyone. And I can read now, and I try really hard to read as much as possible. And for this book in particular, for Matrix, I went back to my college love. I took 2 semesters of medieval French, and I read everything in medieval French all over again. I had to reteach myself medieval French, which was fun. And this book is in conversation with the Lay of Marie de France, who's this like incredible, secretive person. And then I read about mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp. And there's this amazing, I forget the author's name, Sylvia Townsend Warner, The Corner That Held Him, which is like this weird book about nuns. I read everything that there is to read about nuns and nunneries. I went and visited this amazing convent in Connecticut called Regina Laudis, and I'm in love with the nuns. I just want to be a nun. So, I did a great deal of research about the time and the place. My friend Katie Bogus wrote a couple of books that I've read, scholarly books about nuns and the liturgical day and the way that people sort of developed faithful practice. Because I am not actually a Catholic, but obviously the women in the book are, so I had to actually get a lexicon of it. So it was just a lot of joy, a lot of pleasure, and I really, really, really miss my medieval mystic reading for sure. I think I might go back before this book comes out and freshen up.
I think you're going to have a lot of people going to medieval mystic reading after this book. That is for sure. Well, our time is wrapping up, and I cannot thank the 3 of you enough for taking time out of your very busy schedules to spend with us here at our virtual Winter Institute, which hopefully next year we'll be able to see everyone in person and hug and drink and dance with joy. But I cannot thank you enough for spending this time and answer our questions, mine specifically, and just thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
A lot of fun. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Bookstore Education Podcast, brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!